Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. She was found face down in 6 inches of water. Her clothes were folded, her house was locked, and there were no signs of a struggle. At first glance, it looked like a quiet suicide, but something about the scene kept bothering the first responders, and by the time the autopsy came back, it became clear. Somebody wanted this to look too clean. And in Jackson, Mississippi in 1992, that kind of silence didn't mean peace. It meant cover-up. The home was a single-story brick ranch tucked into a cul-de-sac on the south side of Jackson. May 24, 1992. A Sunday evening that had started with lawnmowers and ended in something no one saw coming. The first officer arrived at approximately 10:12 p.m. A neighbor, an older woman who lived across the street, had called 911 after noticing that Gail Mosby's car hadn't moved all day, despite the porch light staying on. Mail was piling up by the door. The neighbor had knocked once, then twice, and gotten no answer. She thought it strange but not urgent, until she remembered Gail's kids weren't home that weekend. Gail should have been there alone. The officer's initial report was calm. No forced entry, no unusual sounds, no signs of damage or foul odor. But once inside, it became clear this wasn't just a wellness check. The home's interior was undisturbed. The TV was off. A dinner plate had been left untouched on the kitchen table. And in the bathroom, the lights were still on. What they found next would redefine the case. Gail Mosby was positioned prone in the bathtub, her upper body submerged just enough for her face to be underwater. Her arms were tucked close. The faucet was off, the water level stagnant, shallow. Her clothing, slacks and a button-up blouse, had been neatly folded and placed on a chair beside the door. A pair of small stud earrings rested on top. There was no blood on the floor, no shattered glass, no open window, and her front door had been locked from the inside. The scene read as calculated, not chaotic. One of the first responders later told investigators, "I've seen suicides, I've seen overdoses, violence, panic. This looked choreographed." The on-scene coroner, unsure of whether to categorize the death as accidental or self-inflicted, ordered a full autopsy. The initial label in the logbook was simply undetermined. By 10:40 p.m., the crime scene photographer had documented over 40 stills, all angles of the bathtub, the folded clothing, the positioning of Gail's limbs. One particular detail would later stand out to the forensic analyst reviewing those images: the symmetry. Her head was centered perfectly in the basin. Her ankles weren't crossed, no drag marks on the tile. The responding officer filed his preliminary notes, highlighting 3 things. The depth of the water, barely 6 inches. No prescription bottles in the immediate vicinity, just one open antidepressant vial, half full, resting neatly on the vanity. A handwritten journal, pages open to what appeared to be reflective thoughts from earlier in the week. Nothing dramatic, no mention of suicide. The officer ended the report with one short sentence: "The scene looks too clean for a natural death." The next morning, an autopsy began. The medical examiner, a veteran of over 300 death investigations, noted no petechial hemorrhaging, the kind you often see in traditional drowning cases. The lungs were not fully waterlogged. There were bruises on the inside of the right ankle, circular, uniform, consistent with restraint, and in the water sample pulled from the tub, a faint trace of blood was detected. Cause of death was formally ruled as asphyxiation by submersion, under circumstances inconsistent with voluntary action. Gail Mosby had not simply slipped under. She had been held. Detectives now had to face a new question. If this wasn't suicide, who would have wanted her dead? And why stage it to look like it was? Jackson PD began building a profile. Gail was 39, divorced, a mother of 2, both away that weekend on a scheduled visit with their father. She worked full-time as a payroll clerk at a local construction firm, had no known mental health breakdowns, and was described by her supervisor as sharp, private, and persistent. She lived modestly. No signs of gambling, no drugs, no erratic behavior. But in her personal life, there were complications. Just 3 months earlier, Gail had filed an enforcement motion in family court, claiming her ex-husband Richard Mosby had been behind on child support for over 6 months. A court date had been scheduled for early June. According to one friend, Gail had been stressed about it, not because she thought she'd lose, but because she didn't trust Richard's new wife, Deborah. She had mentioned weird phone calls and veiled threats, though she had never filed a police report. Detectives flagged the custody and alimony battle as a primary motivator worth investigating, but they didn't jump to conclusions. They needed to speak with Richard and Deborah, confirm alibis, and understand the timeline. Before they could do that, one key detail emerged, something that cracked the first layer of the case wide open. It came not from a witness or a confession, but from the coroner's lab notes. Buried in the report was a reference to the bruising around Gail's ankle, faint but clearly pre-mortem. The ME marked it as grip-induced trauma, likely from one or more hands applying downward force. That detail changed the entire framing of the scene. Someone had held Gail in place while her body fought to breathe. It wasn't impulsive, it was measured, which brought investigators to the next question. Who would stage a murder so carefully? Who would take the time to fold clothing, lock a door, turn down the lights, and create a false narrative of despair? And how many people would it take to make it look that convincing? The physical evidence was clear. This wasn't a suicide. But motive and access remained murky. The detectives needed to reconstruct not just the night of Gail's death, but the last 7 days of her life. Who she spoke to, who knew her schedule, who had a reason to make her disappear. They returned to the scene, this time with a different mindset. As one investigator said, "It's not what was there that told us the story, it was what wasn't." The forensic lab was quiet that Monday morning. No cameras, no questions from reporters, just the steady rhythm of scalpel to skin, suction tubes, and charted numbers. Gail Mosby's autopsy started at 9:23 a.m. on May 25, 1992, conducted by Dr. Emmett Hall, a state-certified medical examiner with over a decade of experience in drowning-related deaths. He'd seen suicides before, he'd seen accidents. This wasn't either. The initial external examination showed no major trauma, no lacerations, no head wounds, no broken bones. That was expected, but it was the smaller details that stood out. On the medial side of Gail's right ankle, Hall noted 2 parallel bruises, each roughly 1.3 inches wide, circular, and already showing early subcutaneous blood breakdown. The bruises weren't recent in a post-mortem sense. They were fresh, and they had occurred while she was still alive. That detail was critical. Next came the internal exam. Her lungs were partially inflated, but not consistent with a classic wet drowning. Instead of being saturated with fluid, they showed patchy edema and mild frothing, both indicative of struggle during submersion, but not prolonged inhalation of water. In simpler terms, she hadn't panicked underwater. She'd been held long enough to stop breathing, but not long enough for her body to flood. Dr. Hall took samples of stomach contents, blood, and cerebrospinal fluid. He looked for anything that could impair consciousness: barbiturates, benzodiazepines, alcohol. Toxicology would take several more days, but early field tests ruled out narcotics and overdose. Her heart showed no signs of attack or seizure. The timeline of death was placed between 7:30 and 9 o'clock p.m. the night before. Importantly, there were no ligature marks, no petechial hemorrhaging around the eyes or inside the eyelids. Again, not classic strangulation, not textbook drowning. What Hall marked instead was mechanical submersion with external restraint. That phrase was not standard, but it was clear. Gail Mosby did not walk into the bathtub and give up. She was alive when she went under, and she didn't stay down by choice. As the body was released for burial, the autopsy file was routed to lead detective Robert Epperson. He'd been with Jackson PD for 14 years and worked several homicide cases involving staged crime scenes. His reaction to Hall's report was simple. We're not looking at suicide anymore. This was control, not chaos. The next step was matching the autopsy timeline to the known environment: water temperature, body temperature, ambient conditions, and time since last contact. Detectives canvassed Gail's neighborhood again. A neighbor recalled hearing nothing unusual, except for what she described as a single slam, like someone closing a heavy door, around 8 p.m. That was consistent with the estimated time of death. But it didn't explain who had been inside or how they had left with the door locked behind them. The entry point was a key concern. There was no forced entry, no damage to locks or windows. Either Gail had let someone in, or they had access. That fact narrowed the suspect pool dramatically. Gail's phone records were pulled. On May 24th, she received no calls after 6:17 p.m. Her outgoing call history ended at 5:39 p.m., the last known contact, a brief call to a coworker confirming her work schedule for Monday morning. Investigators now had a window of roughly 3 hours between 6 o'clock and 9 o'clock p.m. to account for. During that time, someone entered her home, staged a scene, and left without being noticed. But one forensic detail still bothered Detective Epperson: the water line. For the submersion to be fatal, even in shallow water, the victim had to be physically restrained. But there were no fingerprints on the tub edge, no handprints. Nothing wiped down, but nothing left behind either. That absence was suspicious. As he reviewed the scene photos, Epperson made a note that wasn't in the crime scene log: the position of the drain plug. It was manually closed. That's not how most people fill a tub, especially not for suicide. Most people don't think to plug the drain first. They turn on the water, wait, then add soap or bath oils. This tub had been filled with still water, not running water. It was static. That indicated one thing: the water was set in advance. If someone filled that tub and waited, they were planning. The bathtub itself was standard ceramic. There was no traction mat, no towel draped over the side, no hair in the drain. But a sample of the drain was sent to the lab anyway. What came back was a match to synthetic fibers, red and black, similar to a fleece jacket. The only issue: Gail didn't own a fleece in that color, nor were those fibers present in the bedroom closet or laundry area. Someone had worn something foreign to the environment. Someone had come in prepared. The final addition to the autopsy file was a brief note about lividity. Gail's body had settled prone, consistent with post-mortem rigidity, but there was a faint flattening of muscle tissue at the base of her spine, suggesting she had been positioned differently immediately post-death and moved shortly after. It wasn't drastic, but it was enough to prove her body had been adjusted. Again, that didn't point to impulse. It pointed to staging. Epperson quietly added a marginal note to the physical file: if this was suicide, it was done by someone else. The forensic conclusions shifted the case status from suspicious death to active homicide within 72 hours of discovery. The autopsy provided no definitive killer, but it closed the door on the original theory. What was clear: Gail Mosby did not die alone, and someone had taken significant steps to erase themselves from the scene. By the end of the first 72 hours, Jackson PD had moved beyond the bathtub. The house had been cleared. The autopsy had raised too many red flags to ignore. Now came the part that wasn't as neat as lab reports or photos: context. Investigators needed to know what Gail Mosby's life looked like before she died. Not from the outside, from inside her circle. They started with the most documented part: family court records. Gail Mosby had divorced Richard Mosby in early 1991 after 12 years of marriage. The proceedings were civil at first. There was a shared custody agreement, alternating weekends, joint holiday splits, but by late 1991, disputes had escalated. Gail filed multiple motions for missed child support payments, citing Richard's consistent financial neglect. She wasn't asking for more money, just what the court had already ruled was owed. In early May 1992, less than 3 weeks before her death, Gail was scheduled for a contempt hearing against Richard. According to her attorney, she had begun documenting every missed check, every late pickup, every unreturned call. She was organized, tired but organized, the attorney recalled in a deposition. Not the kind of woman who just gives up. That set the backdrop. Gail didn't live in fear, but she didn't live peacefully either. The custody battle wasn't just paperwork, it had become personal, especially after Richard remarried a woman named Deborah Mosby, just 5 months after the divorce finalized. Neighbors reported tension early on. Deborah had been seen driving by Gail's home slowly on multiple occasions. She never confronted Gail, but the passive tracking, watching the kids get dropped off, timing school pickups, had raised eyebrows. Detectives reviewed phone records tied to Gail's landline. In the 3 weeks leading up to her death, she had received 2 hang-up calls after 10 p.m., both traced back to a public payphone on the west side of Jackson. There was no hard evidence of harassment, but it aligned with the emotional pressure she had mentioned to her sister in a letter. A short sentence in blue ink: "I think Richard's wife wants me out of the way." Letters aren't evidence of intent, but they're context. And context gives weight to pattern. Richard Mosby was brought in for an initial interview 4 days after Gail's death. He was cooperative, polite, and presented a calm demeanor. He stated he had last seen Gail at a drop-off the week prior, that their communication was strictly about schedules and obligations, and that they kept distance for the sake of the children. When asked where he was the night Gail died, he said he was home with Deborah, watching television. That alibi, on its face, didn't conflict with anything, but detectives noted a detail. Richard couldn't recall what show he watched, nor could he confirm any phone use, receipts, or visitors that night. Deborah, according to his statement, had fallen asleep on the couch. No timestamps, no corroboration, and then came the issue of access. According to court filings from 1991, Richard still possessed a copy of Gail's house key, despite her written request that all copies be returned. There was no evidence he used it, but there was also no evidence that he hadn't. The house showed no signs of forced entry. The deadbolt wasn't engaged, and a neighbor recalled that Gail had once said she often left the door unlocked on short errands because the kids lost their keys too often. That was a vulnerability. One someone close to her would know. Detective Epperson made a note. No break-in needed if door was expected to be open, or if someone had a copy. Police then spoke with Gail's co-worker, a woman named Carla, who confirmed that Gail had become increasingly stressed over the last few weeks, not just from the financial strain, but from what she called the silence. According to Carla, Gail often said that Richard and Deborah weren't threatening her directly, but made her feel like she was being observed, always watched, never contacted. Carla added something else. Gail had scheduled a child custody modification hearing for the following month. If she had succeeded, Richard's visitation rights would be restricted. That would mean fewer weekends with the kids, more financial obligation, and limited legal flexibility. In family court, that's leverage. In the wrong hands, it's motive. As investigators began charting timelines, one thing stood out. Deborah Mosby had taken a temporary leave of absence from work 2 weeks before Gail's death, citing stress-related fatigue. She was at home, unaccounted for, during multiple evenings leading up to May 24th. No official logs, no digital trail, just space and time. No direct link had yet been made between Deborah and the crime scene, but law enforcement had started compiling a profile that centered on 3 pillars: opportunity, motive, and indirect behavioral pressure. The pressure was building, not in front of cameras but behind closed doors. Detectives refrained from pressing Richard further at this point. Instead, they expanded the scope of the investigation, beginning a quiet financial review of Deborah's bank activity and attempting to trace any unusual transactions leading up to the date of Gail's death. At this stage, the crime had evolved from a mystery to a case study in domestic complexity. It wasn't just about a dead woman in a bathtub. It was about power. Legal, financial, and emotional, and the lengths people go to preserve it. Sometimes the danger isn't in the threats made, it's in the calm that comes before the outcome. By June 1st, 1 week after Gail Mosby was found dead in her bathtub, the investigation had passed its tipping point. No longer a quiet inquiry, it had become an active homicide case with specific targets, even if not formally named. The detectives had gathered the context, identified inconsistencies, and now turned to what often cracks stage stories wide open: the breakdown of an alibi. The initial statements made by Richard and Deborah Mosby had seemed harmless on paper. Richard claimed that on the evening of May 24th, he and Deborah were home watching TV. No guests, no outings, just a quiet Sunday night. Deborah's account matched his word for word. Detective Epperson didn't find that reassuring. In his experience, too much consistency between two people with separate memories often signaled pre-coordination. He didn't confront them immediately. Instead, he ordered a quiet collection of transactional data, starting with phone records, then banking activity, then any traceable movements in or out of their residence. The first break came from Deborah's bank account. On May 15, 1992, 9 days before Gail's death, Deborah withdrew $5,000 in cash from a local credit union in Jackson. It was not part of a regular pattern. Her prior withdrawals were all below $300, typically made bi-weekly. This lump sum stood out, and when asked later, she explained it was for unexpected dental surgery she never got around to scheduling. That response went into the report untouched but noted: no dental receipts, no insurance claims. The second inconsistency came from the home phone line. At 7:03 p.m. on May 24th, a brief incoming call lasting 16 seconds was recorded on the Mosby household line. It originated from a public payphone at a gas station roughly zero point 0.8 miles from Gail's home. The call was too short for conversation. More likely, a ready check or signal. There were no additional outgoing calls from that line for the rest of the evening. Detectives confirmed that neither Richard nor Deborah had left the house according to their statement, but no one else could confirm that either. The absence of verification didn't prove guilt, but it did offer room for contradiction. They also examined Richard's work schedule. Though it didn't conflict directly with the timeline, it added pressure. He had recently received a formal wage garnishment order tied to his unpaid child support. The effective date? June 5th. If Gail had lived past that month, the court would have begun pulling income directly from Richard's pay. That added motive. But again, motive alone doesn't prove action. So the detectives took a different angle. They started looking at vehicle movement. A neighbor of Gail's, who hadn't previously spoken with police, came forward after reading about the autopsy shift in the local paper. She stated she saw a brown sedan parked 2 houses down from Gail's residence around dusk on the evening of May 24th. It wasn't the Mosby's vehicle, but it matched the description of a car tied to a local man with prior charges of battery. Billy Ray Ford. That name was entered into the system and cross-referenced with anyone who had contact with Richard Mosby over the past 6 months. A match came up. Ford had done short-term auto repair work at a local mechanic shop frequented by Richard. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was the first external connection, someone not in the family who could serve as an intermediary. By June 2nd, the working theory was quietly updated. Someone accessed Gail Mosby's home between 6:30 and 9 o'clock p.m. on May 24th. There were no signs of forced entry, which supported either prior access or a key. The house was locked from the inside with no tampering, suggesting the killer left through the front door and locked it manually behind them. And the house, the body, the water, all of it pointed to calculation, not confrontation. One of the most telling discoveries came not from the scene, but from how Deborah handled her own words. During a follow-up interview, she was asked, casually, what Gail had cooked the last time they'd seen each other. Deborah paused, then said, I think it was pasta or chicken or something. It was an odd answer. She wasn't supposed to have seen Gail in weeks. That discrepancy wasn't pursued directly in that moment, but it was documented. As the investigators expanded their digital trace work, they requested access to local ATM camera logs. Though many banks had poor retention policies in 1992, one unit still retained footage from May 15th. In it, a woman matching Deborah Mosby's description is seen handing cash to a man near the back parking lot. He is never identified clearly on camera, but wears a red and black fleece jacket, the same type of synthetic fibers later found in Gail's bathtub drain. A chain was forming, not a straight line, but enough to begin asking deeper questions. Back in the station, Epperson updated the whiteboard with a short bullet beneath Deborah's name. 5K, man in fleece, access to scene, no timeline control. He circled it twice. By June 4th, 2 weeks after Gail Mosby's body was recovered, the investigation reached a point where pattern met presence. Up to this moment, the case had been built on inconsistencies, vague alibis, money that went unaccounted for, and a body that didn't line up with suicide. But now, for the first time, investigators had something that pointed to a third person. Someone not inside the family, but possibly hired by it. His name was Billy Ray Ford. The initial connection to Ford had come quietly. An observant neighbor near Gail's home described a brown sedan parked on the curb the night of the murder, not moving, not idling, just there, as if it didn't belong. When police canvassed the vehicle database within that radius, the plates didn't match any registered to the Mosby family, but one name did come up in an unrelated registry. Ford, Billy R. Born 1960, previous charges including domestic battery, disorderly conduct, and solicitation for illegal services, none resulting in felony convictions, but enough to warrant attention. What linked him more directly was a photo pulled from a local bank ATM camera on May 15th, the same day Deborah Mosby withdrew $5,000 in cash. Footage showed her at the counter, and minutes later, a man in a red and black fleece jacket accepting something from her near the back of the building. The bank didn't have internal audio. There was no facial close-up, but the man's build, height, and gait were consistent with Ford's DMV profile. He had never worked at that bank. He wasn't a customer. What stood out even more was the match between the fibers recovered from the bathtub drain in Gail's home, confirmed to be polyester blend, red and black, not from any garment found in her closet, and the fleece jacket in that footage. Detectives cross-checked Ford's known associates. His name was found once in the client log of a mechanic's garage where Richard Mosby had taken his car in late April. It was the only documented link between the two men. The mechanic didn't remember specifics, only that they talked outside for a bit, seemed like they knew each other. Ford had no alibi for May 24th. He wasn't working. No family could account for his location. When police ran a check on the gas station payphone used to call the Mosby home that night, they found it had also been used by Ford in the past. Records showed 2 outgoing calls from that number tied to a fight he had been involved in months earlier. None of it, in isolation, was enough to make an arrest. But as a narrative built around motive, planning, and access, it put Ford at the outer perimeter of the crime, just one confirmation away from the center. What concerned detectives more was how little Ford had to lose. No stable job. No fixed residence. History of accepting under-the-table cash for odd jobs. And now, a growing presence near a premeditated homicide. When asked later, one investigator said, "We knew someone like Ford wouldn't do this without a reason. The question was, who gave it to him?" At this stage, a new strategy emerged: tighten the pressure. Investigators began tailing Ford's movements, logging any points of contact. He wasn't being followed formally, not yet, but his behavior would be tracked. Meanwhile, a subpoena was issued for Deborah Mosby's phone records, including payphones she may have used in the weeks leading up to May 24th. A partial fingerprint recovered from the ATM envelope she handled during the cash withdrawal came back smudged, but viable. Forensics matched it to Deborah. When confronted with this, Deborah simply said she withdrew the money for emergency repairs, again offering no documentation. The trail was narrowing. The clean staging of the bathtub scene had always suggested collaboration. Now there was a potential executor, a man with no personal connection to the victim but possible financial ties to the family at the center of the investigation. And the fibers, they weren't just material, they were movement, unintentional evidence left behind by someone who thought they wouldn't be seen. By early June 1992, the preliminary forensic review of Gail Mosby's bathtub death had shifted the tone of the investigation. The bruising patterns on her ankles, the oddly dry edges of the bathroom floor, and the shallowness of the water level were all inconsistent with accidental drowning or suicide. Autopsy findings, while inconclusive on cause of death due to water inhalation, supported a likelihood of forced submersion. Still, without a clear perpetrator, it was all theory. That changed when a name surfaced unexpectedly during a routine call check tied to a known local petty offender: Billy Ray Ford. Ford was not on anyone's radar. He had no familial or financial connection to Gail. But what made investigators curious was a tip logged by a patrol unit just outside Rankin County. Ford had allegedly been bragging at a late-night card game that he knew how to make things look like an accident shortly after the date of Gail's death. It was vague and secondhand. But it aligned too closely to ignore. The turning point came not from the boast itself, but from a withdrawal receipt, a $5,000 cash transaction made just 3 days before Gail's death. It was tied to an account belonging to Deborah Mosby, the new wife of Gail's ex-husband, Richard. The receipt had been reviewed during earlier checks into Richard's finances, under the assumption it might relate to spousal support or a legal retainer. But no such expenditure existed. The cash had effectively disappeared, until now. Investigators began reconstructing Ford's movements in the days prior to May 24th. Surveillance logs from a convenience store ATM placed him near the Mosby residence on May 21st around midnight. Grainy footage showed Ford withdrawing small amounts in intervals, behavior commonly associated with an attempt to stay under banking radar. It didn't prove murder, but it proved opportunity and access. There was more. Phone records obtained under a warrant showed multiple calls between Deborah's home and a local payphone near Ford's trailer. These weren't friendly exchanges. The pattern showed short bursts, often under 20 seconds, spaced irregularly across a 10-day period leading up to Gail's death. This wasn't casual contact. This was coded communication. At this stage, homicide investigators convened a joint task team. The case was formally reclassified as a homicide for hire investigation. Ford's name was officially added to the person of interest list, and a background check revealed a prior record of aggravated assault and staged burglary, both dismissed years earlier on technicalities. But what forced the case to escalate wasn't Ford's record or the phone logs, it was his proximity. In a late review of 911 call logs, detectives realized something had been misfiled. A disturbance complaint had been made on the night of May 24th from a neighbor just down the street from Gail's home. The caller reported a strange man standing across the street, smoking, watching the house. No follow-up was made at the time since the death was still being treated as non-criminal. The caller hadn't seen his face clearly, but his build, his haircut, and his jacket, green Army surplus, matched a prior booking photo of Billy Ray Ford. That changed everything. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This was logistical alignment, cash, communications, presence at the scene, and a pattern of staged behavior. Detectives issued a subpoena for Deborah Mosby's financial and phone records to be examined under criminal scrutiny. She wasn't arrested, not yet, but the shell around the alibi she'd maintained, of never being involved and just wanting peace with Gail, was starting to fracture. The transition from circumstantial suspicion to prosecutable conspiracy required one thing: statements that would hold under pressure. By mid-June 1992, detectives organized formal interviews with all three key figures: Billy Ray Ford, Richard Mosby, and Deborah Mosby, conducted separately under controlled conditions. The approach wasn't accusatory, it was tactical. Investigators didn't need confessions, they needed inconsistency. Billy Ray Ford was questioned first. He denied knowing Gail Mosby and stated he was out of town the weekend of her death. But travel logs retrieved from the Greyhound bus station revealed no record of departure. His timeline immediately began to fracture. When presented with ATM surveillance footage showing him in Jackson on May 21st, Ford shifted, saying he might have been passing through. He claimed the $5,000 cash came from selling a truck, but couldn't produce documentation or name the buyer. That claim collapsed when his financial records showed no prior vehicle ownership matching the timeline and no DMV transactions. The cash, once ambiguous, was now suspiciously untraceable. Richard Mosby was more composed. He had rehearsed his version carefully. He hadn't spoken to Ford in years, had no idea about any large cash withdrawals, and described his relationship with Gail as complicated but cordial. But forensic financial analysis told a different story. Cell tower pings from Richard's work-issued pager showed he was within 0.3 miles of Gail's residence the night she died. When asked directly if he had entered her neighborhood that night, he paused, then asked for a lawyer. Interview terminated. Deborah's turn came next. Initially, she was cooperative. She claimed she withdrew $5,000 in May to pay for home renovations and couldn't remember what company handled the job. Investigators gave her space to name a contractor. She never did. Her tone changed when confronted with the phone records. 7 calls from her landline to a Rankin County payphone in 10 days. Deborah said she could have dialed the wrong number. Statistically improbable, the calls were made after midnight. Silent, short, and deliberate. No one makes the same mistake 7 times under cover of darkness. Interrogators didn't need theatrical breakdowns or slammed fists. They watched for micro-reactions. Ford's breath patterns changed when asked about water depth. Richard's leg shook when presented with phone triangulation. Deborah blinked 4 times in 5 seconds when asked whether she feared Gail. Every inconsistency added weight, not as standalone proof, but as confirmation that the story they were presenting didn't align with the digital and physical records. Behind the scenes, prosecutors prepared preliminary charges of conspiracy to commit murder, pending arrest warrants. The forensic report on Gail's ankles had been finalized. Symmetrical bruising consistent with prolonged restraint, not accidental impact. Blood trace analysis from the tub water had confirmed diluted human blood, type O negative, matching the victim. Back at the precinct, an internal note was entered into the shared case system. Next step, coordinated arrest strategy. Deborah and Richard are mobile. Risk of flight moderate. Surveillance recommended. At this stage in the process, one principle became clear. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was an act of design. Quiet, deliberate, disguised as despair. By late fall of 1992, the Gail Mosby case had moved beyond suspicion and theory. The original appearance of suicide had been thoroughly dismantled, replaced with the cold certainty of a staged homicide. Physical evidence, the shallow water line, ligature-style bruising on the ankle, and trace blood in the tub had pointed investigators toward foul play. Now it was time to assign accountability through the courts. Arrests came swiftly. On October 19th, Deborah Mosby was taken into custody at her residence in North Jackson without incident. The warrant was based on multiple witness statements, financial records indicating an unexplained $5,000 withdrawal weeks before Gail's death, and corroborating details from co-conspirator testimony. Within 48 hours, Richard Mosby and Billy Ray Ford were also arrested. Investigators didn't need confessions. Yet within weeks, two of the three would offer them. Billy Ray Ford was the first to fold. Faced with overwhelming forensic linkage, his fingerprints on the interior bathroom doorknob and the water glass on the sink, Ford requested a deal through his public defender. In a signed statement, he admitted to entering Gail's home on the night of May 24th with the help of Richard Mosby, who unlocked the rear door earlier that evening. Ford confessed to holding Gail down in the bathtub while Richard suppressed her head until she stopped moving. He was paid $5,000 in cash, delivered by Deborah Mosby 2 days later at a gas station off I-20. Ford's cooperation came at a price. He accepted a charge of second-degree murder with a 25-year sentence in exchange for full testimony. The district attorney's office, weighing the logistical difficulty of proving premeditation beyond Ford's statement, accepted the plea. His statement reframed the investigation entirely. Not only was this a contract killing, it had been executed with chilling coordination by Gail's former husband and his new wife. Richard Mosby, now directly implicated, soon followed. He initially denied any involvement but changed his plea after reviewing the prosecution's evidence. Surveillance footage showing him at Gail's residence hours before her death, phone logs tying him to Ford, and Ford's sworn affidavit. Richard pled guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. In exchange, he avoided a first-degree murder trial. He provided limited additional information, but did not contest Ford's testimony. Deborah Mosby remained defiant. Through her attorney, she denied any role in orchestrating Gail's death and called the accusations a smear campaign rooted in jealousy and financial tension. The state rejected her claim and moved forward with a full trial on charges of capital murder and conspiracy. The trial began in Hinds County Circuit Court in early March 1993. The prosecution presented a streamlined yet compelling case. Evidence of premeditation centered on Deborah's financial records, specifically a $5,000 withdrawal with no clear justification days before Gail's death, and her contentious custody filings that escalated weeks prior. Her motive was clear. Eliminating Gail would remove a legal and financial obstacle in her newly formed household with Richard. Forensic testimony reinforced the impossibility of accidental drowning. The water in the tub, documented at only 6 inches, couldn't have caused unconsciousness without external force. A medical examiner explained how the bruises around Gail's ankles indicated restraint. Blood spatter analysis suggested her head struck the tub before death. Combined with the fact that her clothes were folded neatly beside the bathtub, the scene lacked signs of panic or distress, classic hallmarks of a staged suicide. Billy Ray Ford took the stand for the prosecution. He testified that Deborah initiated the plan, arranged the payment, and instructed Richard to assist. Despite rigorous cross-examination, Ford's statement remained consistent and unshaken. His cooperation, corroborated by bank activity and Richard's own plea deal, established a prosecutorial chain of credibility. The defense attempted to argue that Ford had fabricated the story for a lighter sentence and that Richard's plea was coerced, but jurors were unconvinced. On the final day of trial, the judge reminded the court that this was not a case built on emotion. It was built on methodical evidence, time-stamped transactions, and signed testimonies. The jury deliberated less than 6 hours. Deborah Mosby was found guilty of capital murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. No appeals were filed in the following weeks. The case, which had begun with doubt and ambiguity, ended with clarity and legal finality. In a brief interview following the sentencing, the lead investigator on the case, Detective Howard Riggins, stated, "Gail didn't slip. She didn't give up. She was ambushed in a space she considered safe. If we had accepted the surface story, the journal, the pills, the silence, we would have left her children with no truth. That wasn't acceptable. The Mosby case has since been used in law enforcement seminars across Mississippi as a cautionary example of staged suicides, particularly those involving close domestic entanglements. Its lesson is painfully simple. Not all crime scenes speak loudly. Sometimes, the most dangerous narratives are the ones that seem tidy. Sometimes, justice takes time, but silence is never the answer. As someone who's spent years studying stories like Gail Mosby's, I've learned that the truth doesn't always scream. It whispers. It hides in bruises overlooked, in tubs too shallow, in voices that were silenced before they could speak. We owe it to every victim, and to ourselves, to listen closely, and never accept what's convenient over what's true. What about you? Have you ever felt like something wasn't right, but everyone else looked away? Share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? And if this story moved you, hit that subscribe button so you won't miss the next case. Let's keep the conversation going.